Welcome, everyone. And thank you for joining the Distributed Energy Resources webinar today. So my name is Julie Bunker. I'd like to show you myself right now on video, but it doesn't appear to be popping up. I apologize. I'm the senior lead for Western Canada, and I'm here located in Calgary, Alberta, for Quest. You know, this is when I say I'm located in Calgary, this is where I sleep from time to time, but we often travel around the country as we are a national organization. I'm the lead here for the working group as well, and I was thrilled to have over 100 people register for this webinar. Whether it's not people want to just receive the recording afterwards, or whether it is to join the working group itself or just to learn more, that was pretty phenomenal to get 100 people here on board. So thank you everybody for your interest. Like I said, I'm here today at SAIT, and we've got a number of people here in the room. And we'll continue to do this, host some of the sessions live as we go through executing this working group. And thank you to SAIT and Colin here for graciously hosting us and getting everything set up. And today on the call, just to let everybody know, I was so impressed to see that we have exactly what we wanted in terms of participants. We have a variety of people joining across the country from coast to coast to coast that range from municipal staff and counselors to tech and service providers, utilities, system operators, academia, research institutes, government of all levels, and from various departments and regulators from across the country joining our discussion today. So thank you and welcome everybody. Before I get started, I wanted to let you know that I've muted everybody since we have a lot of participants on the call, with the exception of Bruce, who will be presenting. So if you do want to speak, you can raise your hand or you can write a message in the chat, which a number of people have been doing. Perfect. Okay, wonderful. Nobody wants to hear everybody eating lunch or the side conversation, so we'll get started there. All right. First off, in a very Canadian manner, if you didn't catch it last night, my news moment is the St. Louis Blues for the very first time won the Stanley Cup title. And I'm bringing this to you, and Bruce, I know you were just in Boston, so don't kill me. But I'm happy to see St. Louis win as an underdog and never winning it before. And I'm unfortunately a Toronto Maple Leafs fan, so I'm not a big fan of Boston. So I'm not going to say I was happy that they lost, but I'm really thrilled to see that somebody who's never won the Stanley Cup has won last night. All right, get into the intent of today's session, why we're all here today. This is really the intent of today's session is really to focus on focusing on the JERS working group, hearing from Bruce Cameron and going through and learning about some of the findings and research about how we might be able to manage some of the unprecedented change and magnitude of change that we're seeing in Canada's energy sector. So a lot of the research that Bruce is going to be presenting on today is going to perfectly lead into the justification and the basis of why we're leading a distributed energy resources working group across Canada. So you'll hear from kind of the intent of today's session. We'll hear from Bruce Cameron. He's got about a 30-minute presentation. And the presentation, Canada's Energy Transformation, Evolution or Revolution, is a discussion paper for Canadian policymakers, utilities, and regulators, as well as key stakeholders on managing the risk and creating opportunities as we build a low-emission energy system. So this was a report that was published between Quest and Pollution Probe. I believe Richard Carlson is also on the line today for any questions. And it was just published in March 2019. So Bruce is going to run us through some of the findings from that research. And then we're going to do a review of the working group itself. So like I said, Bruce's presentation leads really well into it. So we'll talk about the focus of the working group, what's in it for you, the schedule and upcoming sessions, the participants who are involved, the format, and your role as a potential member in this working group. Okay, So as I mentioned, the intent of today's session, share the latest research findings and recommendations for distributed energy resources in Canada's energy sector. We want to provide you with information and details about the Quest Working Group, what it involves and what to expect. You'll gain a better understanding as a participant of how your organization might be able to benefit from participating or playing a role in the working group, as well as how to be part of the discussion going forward. So I'd like to introduce our guest speaker for today, and probably what got a lot of people out to the call is Bruce Cameron, who is a principal consultant and founder of Invigor Policy Consulting Incorporated, as well as a policy analyst and a senior advisor for Quest. Bruce is a longtime leader in energy policy and development. He used to be with the Nova Scotia Department of Energy, and he was leading the development of energy policy strategies, plans, programs, and the regulatory legislative initiatives. Prior to his retirement in 2016, although when he says I put retirement should be in quotations because he's still working very hard, he led the development of the province's electricity plans. He emphasized the importance of energy data collection and management as part of energy innovation agenda, and he was the executive director of electricity, renewables, and energy efficiency. He's also been involved as in the regional energy collaboration in the Maritimes of Nova Scotia with the Atlantic Energy Gateway Initiative. So like I said, he retired and since then has founded Invigor Policy Consulting and has been working with Quest. So with that, Bruce, I will pass it over to you for your presentation on this really interesting and applicable research related to distributed energy resources and policy in Canada.
Thanks very much, Julie. Just a technical matter. Do you change the slides, or is there a way that I can?
I'll change the slides.
Okay, so I'll do that if you could change the slide. Just to set all this off in a bit of a context, is that a little less than a year ago, we were beginning to look at some of the modern issues that were confronting and emerging to affect Canada's regulatory frameworks. And I think it's important to frame this as each of the 13 different provinces and territories have their own markets, they're really sovereign in their own rights as to how they want to design, and they have designed their own systems for energy and their policies and plans. And they have their own framework approach to how they're going to resolve various issues. And so we began to think about things that needed to be probed a little deeper about how we were managing change in the face of increased emphasis on climate change, increased emphasis on how particularly electricity systems, but also natural gas systems are going to adapt to a whole series of innovations that are happening outside the normal regulated framework. And it's governments who set that regulatory framework, and to a varying degree, regulators across the country are tasked with trying to implement what the directions that have been put down in law by governments. And so the whole idea was this transformation that's coming, is it going to continue on as an evolution where people will be able to see some distance ahead and be able to adapt? Or are we faced with a revolution where the pace of change is picking up and things are all of a sudden going to be happening in a way that governments and regulators and utilities really start losing control over the pace of change and how things are worked around them? So if we can go from there to the first slide. So what we did is, this was a partnership between Pollution Probe and Quest, funded by the Government of Canada through the Office of Energy Efficiency. We launched the project by doing more than 40 interviews with people across the country, and really they would be the experts in energy in this country. So they would be people who, at least within a government and regulator and utility framework, these are the people who had a really good idea of what was going on in each of their jurisdictions. And they were the ones that we were trying to find out what they thought was going on. And we also did a great deal of really almost a fire hose look at the literature and the changes of what was going on. For example, we started in early January, and within months, we were having to revise a lot of the basis of information because all of a sudden we were starting to get 2018 data, which was radically different than 2017 data that we were working with initially. And it just shows that the pace of change that's underway. Next slide. And what we're really trying to do is to address that speed of change. As I said, even within the few months that we were initially writing the report and gathering and researching on it, information was changing dramatically. We found that really that pace of change represents very significant challenges for Canadian energy systems. And without giving too much away, it is very clear, and there was a total consensus that the Canadian energy system was not built on the pace of change and the kinds of changes that are happening outside that regulatory system. And they need to really try and figure out how we're going to adapt to that. Next slide. So the pillars of what we were examining are looked at here. What are the drivers? Climate change, how does it affect across the country, the kinds of innovation and how it really impacts on the regulatory system. And I think I'd probably want to just get right into it now. Go to the next slide. So I think it's fairly obvious that we got into growing renewable energy primarily because of climate change. It is the foundation for why society has invested globally in creating new non-fossil fuel sources of energy. And so as that imperative grows stronger, it caused more and more investment, and now it has really supported a great deal of innovation that within a very short period of time has gone from energy sources and systems that need significant support into ones that are now have their own momentum, are now in many cases the lowest cost solution, and are now taking off regardless of whether we go and continue to drive the public agenda on climate change. And let me just pause here for a second on this because it's important. We may have started off with renewables because of climate change. We may have started off, we may have had energy efficiency as now a response to climate change. But in fact, there are many, many drivers of these kinds of technologies and policy directions. And even if in various times climate change kind of fades as no longer the flavor of the month on the political agenda, both on efficiency and technology innovation and renewable energy have now got their own momentums and their own justifications. And so I would suggest to people across the country who are on this call is that you understand that you have many stories to tell and you've got a lot of good things to say. And if somebody says, yeah, but we're not interested in climate change anymore, we think that we've found that there are many other ways to be able to discuss distributed energy resources in a way that has meaning regardless of the political agenda. And one of the great changes that are coming about is that the new technologies are much more scalable. In fact, the fact that they can be scalable and quickly adopted, potentially distributed, all makes the magnitude of change even more important. They are a very nice and tidy response, and in fact, in some ways, when you look at the electricity system, it's going back to the roots, because at the beginning, electricity systems had a generator in virtually every building because they couldn't figure out how to transmit energy in a cost-effective way. And then the technology emerged, and central power plants that delivered energy for a long distance away became the mode because it was less expensive. We're now on beginning to move back into a world where the distributed resources are going to be less expensive in many situations. I would not argue that large-scale energy resources are going out of business anytime soon. There are legacy investments, and they are going to be, particularly in the case of hydro, a clean and useful source of energy. But it's not going to be necessarily the way that everything going forward is going to happen. Next slide, please. It's important for folks to just really step back from time to time and realize that when we talk about a Canadian energy system, or we talk about a distributed energy resources discussion across Canada, we really are talking about 13 different systems. And there are 13 different markets, and therefore one of your probably most important functions is to bring connection to places that normally think about all this in a fairly isolated form. But you also will confront the fact that what is happening in Alberta, or is happening in Prince Edward Island, or in British Columbia or Yukon, may not be something that is going to be the solution in one, is not going to be the solution in another. And a lot of that has to do with the different market characteristics and the kinds of historic generation sources and so on and so forth. You know, the hydro of BC or Quebec or Manitoba, Newfoundland and Labrador is really quite, puts them in quite a different position. In most cases, surplus energy. Whereas in other provinces and territories, particularly where we have fossil fuel, it becomes a real problem in terms of displacing those fuels and trying to move clean. And we're not in a surplus, we're in a deficit. And so how we approach it and the solutions we have will vary in both speed and methodology. And it all depends, as they say, where you stand depends upon where you sit. Your own circumstances will dictate what the positions are. And we see that politically, but there is a strong foundation for that because people have different histories that they need to address, and different opportunities and different challenges. And as a country, we're really at top of our game when we acknowledge that and try and move together regardless of the differences. Next slide. So this is one of the most important lessons that we discovered. Everything is changing faster. The price of renewables is going down. The price of batteries is going down. The ability to manage all of that technologically outside of behind the meter rather than in front of the meter, although there's lots of technologies that are happening in front of the meter and connecting. They're all happening at a pace of change that was not anticipated. When we looked at the price changes, because that changes and drives the market, drives the policies. If all of a sudden wind is available at 3.5, 4 cents instead of 7.5, 10 cents, then you've got a whole different world, because you do have room for batteries, and those batteries are no longer anywhere near as expensive as they were before. There are many more opportunities emerging for people to do things. You probably know all of that if you're involved in this group. But what we also found is that the policies of change There's some fairly good ones, which are along the lines of thinking down the road and trying to set out some goals and clear paths for people to anticipate and to move forward. The bad ones are to constantly change your policies and directions so that everything that everybody was doing yesterday now becomes redundant, and now we do something else. There needs to be a matter of finding a common ground and a consensus. And unfortunately, right now, some of that consensus is fragmenting in this country compared to where we were only a few years ago. And the cautiousness has a whole lot to do with just how we manage it and how we force innovation as opposed to let it evolve. And there was a lot of good advice in the report of where we do need to be cautious. Next slide. So basically what we have is, if we've got new technologies and new things happening and private sector acceleration of ideas and innovation, we do have implications for energy policies and regulatory systems in this country. And really what we need to do is to address the fact that innovation is happening outside a regulatory system that still has a lot of control over what our major energy investments are going to be used for. And one of the things that we have to figure out is how to be better at finding out what the implications of this change are, and be able to test them, measure them, apply, and take lessons out of it. And what we found is that the systems, and everybody agreed, aren't really good at dealing with projects. For example, if in the normal regulatory system, somebody might come forward with a plan to use a different kind of technology or a different business approach, or something like, or even running their integrated resource plans. And they start those processes months and months and months in advance. They have a regulatory process that may take a year and a half. And by the time that they're actually ready to go out and implement it, the assumptions of 2 and 3 years ago are totally out of date. If somebody is doing planning based on the cost of batteries in 2018 and planning to install them in 2020, and they haven't got a plan that adapts and flexibly deals with all of that, then they're going to be really wildly wrong in terms of the costs and the economics and alternatives. And furthermore, what is also a real challenge that we're finding is that it's being able to even adapt to that in a quicker fashion, to be able to say halfway through a pilot or an implementation, there is a better technology, there's another way we can go, or we can test some other things on this. For the utilities that are forced to continually go back to their regulator for permissions to spend or modify plans and so on and so forth, it just puts a real damper on the pace of innovation. And so we were looking at the idea of innovation sandboxes because some utilities across the country are able to operate in a relatively light touch way. They're small. They can be innovative because they don't have as much regulatory burden, but also they tend to be at the distribution level alone, and therefore they're ideal places to explore the new distributed energy resources. And so we're suggesting that each jurisdiction try and find a way to create their own sandbox where the pace of change is accelerated, the allowable pace of change is accelerated in front of the meter, and that you find places where you can cross between the front and the back of the meter, behind the meter, and do a whole lot more holistic testing and understanding of what happens to the rest of the system. Because one of the cautions that we got is be very careful that you don't break the main system as you create the subsystems and the distributed energy resources. And the only way you can find out what the breaking points are is to really start testing different concepts, and we call them sandboxes. Next slide. So, one, we didn't design our systems and policies and frameworks for this. We didn't design it for over a period of 7, 8, 9 years that price of technologies would drop by half. We did not anticipate a world in which the regulated entity may in fact be the more expensive world. Increasingly, customers are finding ways around. Sometimes it is actually not just individual customers, but it is also opportunities for larger customers, commercial customers, to find ways that they no longer, find ways of managing their energy systems that they no longer need to be part of. Or even more frightening for the regulated utilities is that they become phantom customers. That they are notionally still there, but through a combination of efficiency, self-generation, demand-side management tools, they no longer have the same kind of connection with the grid that they once had. And as it becomes more and more cost-effective for customers to manage their own energy systems, and then they only need a thread with the regular grid system, then that is going to raise huge issues for those who are left behind. And the stranded assets is really also about the stranded customers, the customers who are left having to bear the burden for the whole system, and assets that, because of obsolescence and changes in demand for the generation, the energy supply, has gone away or gone down and be reduced, then there's more and more, those assets still need to be paid for and amortized. And one of the things that we looked at very, very carefully was whether there was a consensus that the electrification agenda would, in fact, create a balance here. And there is some danger that we may be disrupted significantly as the demand reduction agenda comes to the fore before electric vehicles and wholesale changeover from fossil fuels to electricity in many of the building systems starts picking up the slack. And in any case, it may be that the electrification agenda increasingly happens behind the meter. And so that still presents problems for utilities. Next slide. So out of all of this, based on what we heard, everybody seemed to think it was fairly important that we actually have a long-term vision. Regardless of political stripe, the people who set the course for energy change in this country need to be encouraged to build a long-term vision of where they want to be, and then be able to start articulating how they're going to get there. We have to be able to then, within that vision, anticipate and respond faster by providing a lot of flexibility and a lot of learning and testing, and then really roll out the new lessons learned much faster. We need to share it. We need to have groups like this one where people are able to say, well, we tested that idea out in Nova Scotia, and this is what we found. And somebody else says, yes, but it didn't work for us. That kind of sharing and learning is really, really important. We've got to address explicitly the risk from obsolescence, stranded assets, and customer departures. If investors are uncertain about how everybody's going to manage the change and the kind of threats that come from all of this, whether it's going to be put on ratepayers or whether taxpayers will play a role. Investors care very much about this, and they will price the capital accordingly. And of course, every single utility across the country has investors. Even if they're crown corporations, of course, have bonds that they've gone to the markets. There are many private utilities that are seeking equity as well as debt. But everybody needs to be responsive to investors who are lending and investing in directly through ownership and equity with their plans and futures. And a failure to do that just means that it's going to become more and more expensive, and again, passed on to the ratepayers. It's important that we look at a holistic picture. Energy efficiency is really important, and spending time and effort and resources on reducing the amount of electricity that we have is important for individual customers who are able to take advantage of that. But we don't want to have this really bad disconnect of just planning for a shrinking world of energy use. There are great opportunities for electrification, and although we did not have electrification as a focus, it is an obvious thing that people raise time and time again, particularly in the energy surplus hydro provinces. This is a big issue for them, and so that has implications for distributed energy resources as well. And ultimately, what we're going to do is we're going to have a new balance. We're not wiping out central power systems, and we're not going to stop distributed power systems, but we will have a new balance where both of them play an important role. And the best outcome we can hope for is one where the system is much more dynamic in accepting that there is great value from both, rather than saying one has got to go or one has to be stopped. Next slide. So the next steps are really the conversations like this one, building a conversation among many, many people, and trying to get more and more partnerships to have the conversation and to carry out the work, and to start having people really have custom designed discussions in their jurisdiction, because although there are many commonalities, the kind of discussion that's going to go on in Alberta is going to be quite different from Nova Scotia. And as each of the jurisdictions begin to come to grips with all of this, they will be open for discussions. We counted at least 5 jurisdictions across the country that candidly were saying they were having a very deep think about how they're going to address these issues. They may not have publicly engaged with people yet, but they are thinking about it in a deep and serious way. So we have an opportunity to begin to get much more educated about what this is all about, and encourage that kind of innovation and that agenda to test and learn faster, and faster. So I think that's the end of it, Julie, and I hope we've got time for discussion. Bill?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bruce. So, sorry. We do have a number of questions from the audience that have popped up already here. Oh, sorry. One of them being, from Terry. Oh, there's a number of them from Terry. What role should government play in ensuring that distributed energy resources are used as parts of the blended mix of energy, and what are the commitments by government that should be identified for energy storage as part of the solution, given the intermittency of distributed energy resources?
So, first of all, one would hope that the government policies strategy start off by recognizing that distributed energy resources are a key part of the grid of the future and energy systems of the future. You start off with that policy, and then the second thing is you say, that's a good thing. And in typical government fashion, it probably is. It's a good thing because people are already doing it. If I try and stop it, then it's going to be a really difficult thing. So first of all, embrace it. And then secondly, begin to get the utilities and other stakeholders into a conversation about where that new balance is going to be. And energy storage is clearly part of the solution. What is happening here, though, is that because the price of batteries is dropping so rapidly, it's going to be a very difficult kind of conversation for groups that are used to, well, I've established the price of this over the past 10 years and it's always this and this is what it's going to be. I mean, the typical thing is everybody knows what a combined cycle natural gas power plant is going to be. You can plug that into any plan and you can say, okay, there it is, and you just worry about the cost of fuel. But you can't do that with a battery right now, because you have to then say, but we assume that the battery is actually going to be 10% less next year and 10% or 15 or 20%, or it could be 50 within 4 years. So all of a sudden, you're making different kinds of decisions that a risk-adverse system is not used to making. And so that's why there needs to be ways to kind of ensure you know exactly what it is, and then start setting up regulatory processes where you have to make some forward assumptions, and you're allowed to make those without being beaten up totally by more conservative forces.
Perfect. All right, we've got a couple of other questions here. Bruce, do you see microgrid operation and maintenance as non-regulated light touch utilities?
I suppose they are, in fact, a utility in the small U normal common understanding. But the challenge is at this point that utilities are kind of, in the Canadian framework, somebody that's serving multiple customers. And most of the regulatory frameworks in Canada suggest that once you are serving multiple customers, then you become a public utility and are falling into the regulatory world. So what the microgrids tend to be is they tend to be at this point not serving multiple customers. But I do see them as an opportunity to be the demonstrator and innovator kinds of structures where they do not have to fall under full public regulation. But perhaps in the public interest, they still need to be managed and reviewed without being micromanaged and micro-reviewed.
Same question. Bruce, what about community microgrids? Where do you see it at the community level?
So community level, again, there's going to have to be this reconciliation about whether they're going to emerge into full-blown public utilities that need to be overseen. So what we have seen in some jurisdictions, though, is small communities, thousands of people, not tens of thousands of people, and certainly not hundreds. But when you get down to thousands, if you've got innovative leadership, you can operate a community distribution level utility without necessarily being micromanaged. And so I think that's the challenge. Can governments find a way for that to happen? And for utilities, the challenge is, if the communities are going to desert the main system and set up their own little microgrids and turn their backs on the legacy utilities, Then you get into that stranded asset, social equity, people who can't afford, live in rural areas, all of a sudden they're bearing the burden of everything. What we see is much more the possibility of even the incumbent utilities finding ways that they can engage with community to meet community interests and needs on new ways of doing business, but still doing it perhaps using some of the capital resources of the existing utilities, find innovative revenue partnership sharing and so on and so forth. It's a whole new community utility relationship that needs to evolve here. Otherwise, we're going to have some very unfortunate unintended consequences that have to do with social equity and a lot of really unfortunate things that will happen on our path to change.
I've got a question here from Terry, I believe, who's in Digby, Nova Scotia, specific to a question of something that you're seeing in Nova Scotia that might be applicable to other jurisdictions as well, and is how is the renewables to retail new market that enables independent renewable energy producers to sell directly to retail customers working out in Nova Scotia?
I don't believe there's been very much take up at all on that particular construct. And I think that part of the reason is that it still is seen as somebody builds a generation resource and needs to then find a customer that is on the other side of the incumbent utilities wires. So in other words, you build a wind farm and you've got 50, 100, 150 megawatts of wind that you want to sell to customers on the other side of the province. And you have to use the wires of the incumbent utility. Plus in Nova Scotia, there's a framework and says, by the way, when you use those wires, you have to pay price so that none of the other customers that are on that system are disadvantaged. And so not surprisingly, the cost is quite high. The interesting part, though, is that, we were thinking about those things 3, 4, 5 years ago. And I would argue that really the emphasis much more on community and micro things happening that we've had the conversation just now is it makes it a whole lot less likely that people are going to want to do that. Instead, they're going to want to try and find ways that buildings, community buildings, institutions, hospitals, schools, and so on and so forth can literally have their own microgrids where you don't have to worry about the rules about selling into the grid and getting to another customer far away. Your customer is going to be very close, going to be behind a meter, and all of these other rules are going to be beside the point. I'd be glad to pick up that conversation with Terry.
Perfect. I've got a couple of other quick questions here, hopefully. Marlo Curry, who I recognize the name from my days at Stantec. How do you see micro or distributed standards and regulations evolving?
So I think about standards as being, making sure that they are reliable and that the processes of interconnection and so on and so forth happens in a safe and reliable manner. In terms of the actual policies, this is, quite frankly, there will be no Canadian standard. There will be solutions in each of the jurisdictions. There may be aspects that are quite common across the country, but the solution will have to be done 13 times over minimum. And in that world, it's going to evolve partly by a push from people who are concerned that if we don't do this in kind of a planned way, it's going to look really ugly in an unplanned way. So it's going to be a push by that, but it's also going to be reactive in the sense of all it'll start to get people panicking is a bunch of large customers in a very visible way leaving the system or reducing their energy demand in a noticeable fashion, that all of a sudden people are going to say, whoa, wait a second. we're going to have to do this. Quite frankly, it's going to be a whole lot better to have those conversations a few years before the economics get there so that it just starts happening. But we talk about a tipping point, and a tipping point really is, when you think about it, you've come to the edge and you tip over, and it really is, the image is correct. All of a sudden, a lot of the load can start doing other things. Then it becomes, the whole system becomes in a tip, I guess, is what the British would say. In any case, just to go back to the question of how does it evolve, it evolves in a way that says this is an economic reality, this is a technological reality, and you can either adapt to it in a fairly quick evolution, or you're going to get blindsided by a truck when people just go. If somebody has the arrogance to say, we can stop distributed energy economic solutions for customers and stop them from doing things behind their meter, then you got a real revolution, and it'll be a political one.
I'll ask one last question here, and we'll have to move on, unfortunately, but I will be passing all the questions along to Bruce afterwards to try and get to the ones that we didn't get answered. But on the technology side, this one's kind of related. In how strong of a role should data and digital technologies be playing in Canada's response to the energy transition challenge? Smart grid solutions and a host of other solutions for monitoring and managing energy systems, for example. So how strong of a priority should this be for policy development around the data and the digital technologies?
So I think it is a very important piece of the energy system of the future. We did some work through Quest a couple of years ago on the issue of data and policy frameworks that need to be there. You know, there can always be a customer to provider relationship. And that's how a lot of our data is done today. I think we miss the public benefit of being able to plan better and to understand what's going on if we can't find a way to get across the privacy issues. And unfortunately, as I say, today, the provider just signs them up, customers one by one, and then they get used to the data in a customer provider relationship. You know, in order to get my service, you need to give me your data, and you know that's the way it happens in a whole lot of things. The way it'll continue to happen, and it will be an important part of the how we can evolve very, very sophisticated relationships, contracts, and ways of doing business better. I just think that it's really important to also find ways to get public access to the data in a de-identified way, but still in a useful way. And that's what kind of makes governments, it's more difficult for them to do that. Ironically, the commercial world is much easier.
Great, thank you so much, Bruce. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for questions, unless there's more. Perfect. All right. Well, thank you. Like I said, I'll pass those questions on to Bruce. I know that there was a couple of questions on the vehicle to grid side of things that I'd like to save possibly for another discussion, but I've noted them here. So thank you, Bruce, so much for that, and thanks and appreciation for all the great questions. And transitioning from what Bruce said and a lot of the things that he just ended on in terms of what the next steps are here. Continuing the discussion, growing the discussion, developing the partnerships to carry on this work. That is really the essence here and the basis for the Distributed Energy Resources, or the DERS working group that Quest is leading with our partners and what we're aiming for. Like you said, Bruce, sharing information about across projects, across communities, regions, about what we tried, what we didn't, is is only, in a lot of cases, we're looking for opportunities to make things more efficient, to not reinvent the wheel jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but learn from each other in ways that we can more effectively move forward across Canada. If you want to continue hearing information, updates from this research that Bruce and Quest and Pollution Probe are doing and others, continue to be part of this working group that we're going to be getting into a little bit of the details. And please join us in continuing the discussion to learn more about what the key industry findings are. We're really looking to create that platform to help develop a lot of these partnerships in the industry by educating, connecting, and influencing across communities, utilities, regulators, technology and service providers, et cetera. All right, so getting into the actual, what the working group itself is about, I'm going to go through some of this pretty quickly because we've already covered it. I know a number of you have participated already in the info sessions that we held earlier this year and late last year about what this working group is about. And like I said, it really builds off of the need of what Bruce just presented on here. So this is one of my favorite diagrams here, which Bruce essentially has spoken to, is the energy evolution, and that this power grid is considered one of the largest and magnificent machines in the world, but it is very complex, and we're seeing a lot of changes that are occurring on the system, from the centralized top-down grid delivery system to one of more distributed energy resources where electrons are now moving in the opposite direction on the grid. And in order to compensate for that, it really does, and the changing of the system, it really does align with what Quest focuses on for smart energy communities. And that is where we're seeing a lot of community-based generation or generation and resources, both electric and thermal, at the distribution level, is it really focuses on what we try to advance with smart energy communities. And that is looking at how energy resources, leveraging local, renewable, and conventional energy resources to help our energy resources be more affordable and delivered cleanly and efficiently to meet our community energy needs. And so this is, connected through energy efficiency, all the way to land use planning, which is where we get a lot of the municipalities tied into this as well. That traditionally, a lot of the times with energy planning, both at the transmission and distribution level, hasn't involved kind of the municipal land use planning side of things. And that's where we try to tie it all together and bring the right stakeholders together in an effective platform to have these discussions. So the DERS, or Distributed Energy Resources Working Group focus, is really on, like I said, both thermal and electric systems that are connected at the distribution or community level. We're talking about, like I said, the things that Bruce mentioned about the systems and the drivers that support them. Why are we seeing a push here? Like we said, there's a number of reasons from for municipalities as being potential revenue generation and job creation within their community, community resilience perspectives as well for municipalities, to other service providers, looking at microgrid designs. There's different drivers depending on who the stakeholder is. The system operator is not going to have the same drivers or supports necessarily for distributed energy resources like a community might want and that the utilities are seeing. So that's some of the discussions that are going to be explored, both social, economic, and environmental considerations. And then, where should they be implemented and what is needed to enable successful implementation. So looking at potentially like a roadmap or framework for this. Like Bruce said, it's coming, whether, we are naive to ignore the fact that we are seeing more of this. The challenge is, how do we do this effectively, successfully, without A, disrupting the system, and B, without pushing a lot of those costs down to the ratepayers. So through this, we're engaging, like Bruce said, expanding and growing the conversation to other stakeholders. This is traditionally done in a very siloed approach. between municipal levels, utilities, provincial levels, system operators, and regulators. So we're really trying to engage the relevant stakeholders across multiple sectors for this discussion. And so that, like I said, involves various levels of government, the telecommunications industry, so I know data was brought up as well, and some of those big players. Microsoft is one of, for example, Quest's large sponsors, and kind of the data of things and the Internet of Things plays into this as well. So having those conversations and bringing in the right stakeholders to focus discussions. And the approach that we're doing here, really the focus of the working group, is to first educate, then connect, and then influence. And I'll get a little bit more into how we have framed this both at the national and the regional level for the discussions. And really the action here is this is a working group. It's facilitated by Quest, but really we are trying to create the basis of having a common understanding and educating between the various stakeholders. And we've seen this through a number of work in the projects that we've done of really creating a baseline of educating and understanding each other's businesses. Then we move to connecting, so a lot of the peer-to-peer learnings and lessons learned across the regions, and where appropriate and where needed on the influence side of things. So it's really the three key pillars that we work in here is with our facilitating our working groups. Okay, now I'm going to get into the meat of it. The format of this working group is national, with webinars that are like the one that you participated in today that will be held bi-monthly, as well as supplemented with regional in-person sessions. Like I said, we see the value in, there's no way that you can get away from the value of sitting face-to-face in a room, and like Bruce said, there's 13 different jurisdictions across Canada, and they're all going to have their unique challenges and issues. So those conversations are really important at the regional level, but there's also great value in bringing up those discussions at the national level to share updates on what's going on between different provinces as well. So we're going to be having the facilitated sessions bi-monthly at the national level, alternating between regional focused in-person meetings. This model was chosen, like I said, because of the varying policies that are experienced across Canada. And the aim is really to create a neutral and trusted platform to educate and connect the participants and influence the industry, the regulators, and the governments of all levels. We're aiming to build trust and relationships between participants so we can effectively accomplish in person what is the most important drivers agenda, the most important driving agendas for a lot of these key stakeholders. And so there's a number of also similarly aligned organizations doing this region to region, and that's where we're engaging them as well to help support this this working group and have the discussions brought up to the national level. There's a couple of other key things that that are part of the working group. So there's a private LinkedIn page for sharing events, industry news, and any updates. It's been communicated that there's so much going on across Canada and you can't be everywhere at once. So kind of saying, there's a large, smart grid or renewables conference going on that's applicable here, who's going to it. It's a place for people to share their kind of key takings or key findings and takeaways from those conferences. We'll also be having a private Google Drive for resources, publications, and session notes and recordings, like the session from today in case you missed it. So it's access to a lot of information as well as a larger network. Okay, so I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into what this looks like at a national perspective. So this is similar to this webinar that we had today. The focus is really, like I said, on that educating piece. It's a platform to educate participants on the latest nationally applicable research, projects, publications, lessons learned, news, and use cases. It will include some work Quest is directly involved in, like the research that Bruce spoke to and covered today, as well as other relevant industry projects and findings that are transferable nationally. So this was another one that we did, the planning alignment in Ontario. Quest also has the ear of energy regulators nationally and has been involved in working with CAMPUT over the last number of months. So CAMPUT is an association made up of Canada's energy and utility regulators and commissions, and we've been discussing the importance of addressing opportunities and challenges that will arise as a result of the ongoing energy industry transition. So we'll cover some of the updates here in the national discussion as well, and some of those conversations that we're having with regulators at the national level. And as well, we will be presenting and exploring external sources like the recent Mowat Energy publication on the role of regional planning, new benefit cost methodologies, and the competitive landscape for DERs. So this is a really relevant report that was recently released. So we'll be engaging, we'll be doing kind of at the national level reviews of publications like this and bringing on the guest speakers and the authors of these reports to be able to brief you on them. So you don't always have to go through and read the entire one, but the entire report, but you'll get an understanding of what it is and the interpretation of it. And then finally, anything that is has a bit more of a regional focus, but might have lessons learned or might be transferable to other provinces and jurisdictions as well. So here's an example of one that came out of the Ontario Energy Board recently. So Quest also works with a number of federal organizations, such as the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, NRCan, and others, and is working, and with this working group, it may be used as a platform to share some of the key findings and results from projects across the country. I mean, how many of you on the call have been a part of a project where great lessons learned were come out of it, and then it just kind of got shelved and nothing happened after the project? This happens a lot, unfortunately, and so I know that there's a number of mechanisms being put in place on how we share those learnings across Canada, some of the great work that's being done at a national level and funded by a number of the national entities. All right. So Bruce mentioned earlier, with the 13 jurisdictions across Canada, each has unique and varying energy market considerations with significant implications and therefore policy regulations that need to be managed and are transitioned different in each province. Therefore, the national webinars like this, the second kind of pillar or main focus is to connect, is to take what we're going to talk about in regionally focused sessions and bring it up to provide updates, share findings and learnings, and gain insights into the other markets. Because ultimately, we are working towards a lot of the similar goals for effective evolution of our energy systems, and we want to share these lessons learned across the provinces. I myself have worked in Ontario, various maritime provinces in Alberta, and as part of a national organization now, I can honestly say that sharing between the different regions is not done enough. We so often put our blinders on what is going on in our own backyard and fail to realize that we're usually not the first to attempt something. So this has been identified by a number of you, and in a lot of the work that we've done, that peer-to-peer learning is there, and sharing across jurisdictions is very valuable. There's also some organizations part of this working group and on this call who operate across multiple provinces, and there are others that are interested in exploring opportunities or connections in other provinces. So this is where the national webinars will benefit you as well, and you can join in even though you're not maybe located in Alberta or Ontario. You can still join into those sessions to gain a better understanding of what will be going on. The national calls, like I said, will be supplemented with regionally focused sessions across Canada, and that they will report up to the national calls with the relevant updates. Like you see, this image here is just an example of where we have boots on the ground in terms of leads for Quest already. So this is where we're going to start. But we also are working on projects in other regions, in Newfoundland, in Manitoba, in British Columbia, in Quebec, in the Yukon. And so we're looking for champions from those regions. So if you're on this call and you're in one of those regions, we're looking for champions to potentially who are familiar with the market there to present or to host a regional session and be part of the working group. All right, so these are our regional session leads. Quest currently has regional leads that will help host and facilitate the in-person regional sessions for the Distributed Energy Resources Working Group. If you're part of Quest and know our network, you probably are familiar with some of these spaces, as they also run other regionally focused regular working groups throughout the provinces, where distributed energy resources are often discussed to some degree. And this will report up to the national level based on any updates from those meetings. And in some cases, there might be some combined meetings. So we've got Eddie in New Brunswick, Samantha in Halifax, and she leads the Nova Scotia working groups. Eric is newer to our team, and he's based in Toronto. Ida is finally have somebody else with me here in Calgary. And then you can't see me on video, but there's my picture there, and located in Calgary. So we are already across the country, and we have expertise and knowledge of the industries across Canada, and that's what we're trying to bring to the table here, is being able to leverage those networks and share that information to a greater audience. So we also partner with, we've got senior advisors, subject matter experts, and partner organizations, both nationally and provincially, who will be helping to inform and facilitate these regional sessions. Okay, a little bit more on the regional sessions specifically. So what you can expect to experience in your region. The objective of these sessions is to, first off, lightly educate. And this is dependent on the regional participants, how informed they are already and what's going on in the market. For example, here in Alberta, Quest, along with others, are involved in certain inquiries with the regulator, with the AUC, the Alberta Utility Commission, for distributed energy resources. This might be some of the things that we talk about for those who are not already up to date on what's going on in the Alberta market, but it really varies of who the participants are going to be and how informed they already are, because the next step is really on connecting. And that is really the focus of the regional sessions, is that face-to-face interaction and connecting. It builds on the educating, and is the main area of focus. So we're looking at connecting stakeholders across the various levels of the grid, exploring the drivers, the opportunities, and the challenges for each, and looking at opportunities for projects and collaboration. So through the work that we've done and a lot of what we've heard from you, we know how important these local in-person connections are when they're facilitated and when you're given a neutral and trusted platform to discuss the opportunities and challenges that you're having in your market and how we might be able to move forward together. So this isn't just a quick conference connection. We're looking for building those relationships and looking for those opportunities. And this is not, we find there isn't a lot of platforms that often do this regionally. And we've done this in a number of places, like in Ontario when we had our planning alignment project that we worked with the independent electric system operator, a number of the transmission and distribution utilities, as well as some of the local communities there, in better connecting them. And it's incredible the value of just having that platform to discuss the different, realizing that you've got those different stakeholders have different drivers, that they have different business models and language that they use, timelines for approvals for things, and just connecting them better and getting them to better understand their drivers, their opportunities and challenges for moving forward, created great alignment and helped to create more of a positive story about how we're going to move forward with a number of initiatives. And then finally, influence. Where there is a need and where there is alignment, Quest often advocates with a multi-stakeholder approach to various levels of governments and regulators. We do this through a number of our working groups where it's needed and when there's appropriate. It's kind of more of that evolution of we will get there eventually once we kind of create that baseline of what needs to be done and where the industry would like to go. So we help advise. value to you. Municipalities, this is your opportunity to be heard in these sessions. Be heard by your energy service providers and share what are your drivers for distributed energy resources in your community, and with your utilities, the product, the tech, and the service providers and developers who want to work with you, as well as the province so they can support you in your energy projects and vision. It will help these stakeholders understand how projects get through municipal government, what your council might be looking for, what's important to your community, as well as learn about some of the other projects and opportunities for funding. This is where financiers will also come into the conversation. For product and service providers, for developers, for utilities, this is an opportunity to share with the customers and the businesses and the stakeholders that you want to work with, the challenges that you might have in getting projects moved forward on their side of things, and helping them to understand your business model so that they can better work with you for the feasibility of projects and to create a positive business case. We've heard from a number of organizations who are trying to move forward community-based generation projects and have trouble with, really it's just the alignment of with the customer on funding, how they get projects approved. So we're trying to create some alignment there. And then for the regular and policymakers, this is an opportunity to be heard or to hear those that you regulate and serve on what they want, what their drivers are, and be on the floor with them to hear the conversations, the project proposals, beyond just like a formal inquiry process, and understand how fast they are trying to get going so that we can best evolve our policies and regulations to manage the unprecedented change to our system. How do we develop more agile policy to keep up with this change? And this is the approach that we're taking on it, because I've lumped it here into users and producers, the operators, and the enablers on the grid. So this is really, the sessions will start with a focus on the grid's edge. So at the distribution level with the users and the producers and with the communities, that is and when I say communities, I mean the municipalities, the schools and the campuses, the businesses and the industry that supports the community. We'll be speaking with or focusing on the product and technology and service providers, the developers, those working to install or manage the distributed energy resources, and focus on some of the project examples, challenges, and opportunities and insights from each of the key stakeholders along the grid. Then we'll be moving over to the operator side of things, more so the focus for the fall of this year. That's the system operators, the utilities and energy service providers, and the aggregators, those that have to manage the distributed energy resources that are being connected. And then finally, moving on to the enablers. So that's the regulators, the provincial and federal governments as well, and hearing from them. And with the upcoming federal election in October, I positioned this for winter 2019-2020 to hear from what the new government and engage with the new government at that time. So building on that, in terms of a schedule, building on this idea of starting at the grid's edge with the communities where distributed energy resources are installed, and moving up to hearing from the enablers so we get the perspectives of multiple stakeholders along the grid. The schedule for this for the working group will be, the next session will be held the last week of July, and it will be a regional session, and I'll host it here in Alberta, and also work with my colleagues to possibly host one in Nova Scotia as well in alignment, so they will look the same, and there'll be similar discussions, but with different regions. That will focus on the users and the producers. Going into August, and again, I say the last week of August, it depends on people's vacation schedules and how many people we can get. We'll be more focused on, again, the users and producers at the national level. So you'll see it alternating between regional sessions and national webinars, and they help support each other. So the regional sessions will provide updates to the national webinars, as well as we'll have a featured guest speaker or something that we cover that's relevant at a national level. So this is just a glimpse of where we're going to take things and the focus of the sessions over the next number of months. In Ontario, we'll look at hosting a regional session in September. And then the December is up for grabs, depending on the participants and where we see the drive to have a locally held session. So, wrapping this up, following this session, you will receive a number of documents related to this working group. That is one, a recording of the session as well as the slides. You will also receive a package that contains the working group background and detailed description. So I hope you can see this. Yes, you should be able to. So this is really the background document of what this working group is about, the challenges and opportunities, the strategy and approach that's being taken, and the objectives. You'll also receive the working group charter. Which is really a document that establishes at a very high level, this is the frequency of this working group. This is the scope, the objectives, the key participants, the format, the budget of it, and the expectations of the participants, including, like I said, this is not just of, as a working group, as a participant. I'll go into in a minute here some of the expectations around that as well, or what you can expect. And it just requires a sign-off. So this is just an identification of this is what the working group is and that you are wanting to be a part of it, as well as the 2019-2020 DERS working group work plan and schedule. It's kind of hard to see here, but it essentially talks about the objective, the activity, and the timeline, as well as the intended outcome for each one of the sessions and what we're going to be focusing on. So it aligns similarly to the discussion here of what we had in terms of the regional versus the regional sessions and the national webinars, as well as how the approach that we're taking for, like I said, starting at the grid's edge and moving our way inwards in terms of the themes and who we're going to hear from, so we can create that baseline of before we continue to move forward on what the next steps are. So to continue your participation in this working group after today, as a nonprofit, in order to do the research and the great work that we do to facilitate a lot of our working groups and sessions, the materials and the connections that we make is we rely on our sponsors, our subscribers to Quest. And so Quest working groups are exclusive to Quest subscribers, partners, and our funders. And so I will get into a moment here about if you are not, I know a lot of people on the call are already Quest subscribers, but if you are not, or if to join more than one working group, I'll go over that in a moment of how to do so. So following this session, like I said, once you have received the charter and you want to be part of the working group and get registered for all of the future sessions, both national and regional, we'll get you to sign the charter, and that way you will be connected and on the list for registering for all of the future events. You'll also receive, once you sign up for the working group, private access to the Google Drive for the resources, the meeting materials, etc. You'll be invited to join the private LinkedIn group. You'll also be added as a Quest subscriber to the next Quest Smart Energies Community Catalog, where we have a description of all of our subscribers for Quest, and gain access to other Quest resources, networks, and events. And so I will send some information on about what it means to be a Quest subscriber in a little bit more detail in that email follow-up from the session here. What to expect. Managing expectations is important. This is a working group, so your active engagement and participation is key to the success of the working group and getting value of it. This means that when we want to go out and hear from at the user or producer level, the municipalities, the communities, the product and service providers, that we're looking for you to step up and share your learnings and be a presenter and participate in the in-person sessions and show up. It's also a living thing. So it will evolve and adapt based on the participants and their needs. The regional sessions might look different region to region. They likely will. And as we grow the working group and evolve, it will adapt to where the greatest area of needs are. And that's what we're doing with, like I said, starting at the grid's edge and working inwards of where the greatest areas of need that we want to focus on going forward in 2020. It's creating that baseline, and then how we move forward is how the working group will evolve and what the market is doing. And the aim is to develop relationships and create that neutral platform that we talked about for constructive discussions and for work to be done in collaboration with other stakeholders. So, you know, come in, you know, I know that there's always a competitive nature involved with getting in a room with a bunch of different stakeholders, absolutely. But come and be open to sharing what you can and working with other stakeholders and like municipalities and like levels of government and product and service providers on how we move forward more effectively. The amount of work that's involved here is huge. And I think that the sandbox is large enough for most of us players to be in there. So how do we do that most effectively? So for joining Quest, go onto our website. I'm going to link it right here. You select Get Involved from the main page, the big yellow button, and you scroll down. We have a couple of things of signing up for our newsletters. Where you want to go is becoming a subscriber. So if you are not a subscriber today, you are required for one working group to be a basic subscriber, which is $1,500 a year. There's many other benefits to being a Quest subscriber, which I will include in the package itself. If you are already part of the Quest network and you are a member of a single working group but want to be engaged in more like the DERS working group, you might need to be bumped up to an expansion subscriber package, which is for 2 or more working groups. And there's other levels here as well. But I will send that information along directly into an email following this meeting. So like I said, there's other benefits to becoming a Quest subscriber. If you have any questions on where you stand as a Quest subscriber and what the benefits are, this is the information for Helen Plattis, who is our Director of Client Services. So she will deal and handle with all the subscriptions and any questions that you might have around them. If you have any questions specific to the actual details of the Distributed Energy Resources Working Group, you can reach out to myself. If not, you can go directly on the website and sign up. It will either ask you to pay directly or you can say by check and it will send you an invoice. But if you have any questions about subscribership, then to reach out to Helen Plattis, and I will leave her information up here and I will CC her on the email that goes out. So I have a number of questions that I see here in the chat that I'm going to address quickly, or at least try to. Oh, there's a lot of them. I'll need to follow up with them afterwards there. Perfect. So, like I said, the focus of the working group is to educate, connect, and influence. As Bruce alluded to, there's a lot of challenges, and this is a complex problem, and it's going to take multiple stakeholders to better align together in ways that we haven't worked together before to make sure that we have reliable sources of energy going forward and keeping up with the pace of technology and changes that we're seeing. Working at the community level, I see a lot of drivers for microgrids, community-based generation, and it's coming fast, and it's how we adapt to it. And how we work together and how we can successfully make our energy system of the future reliable, affordable, clean, and efficient for both ourselves and those generations to come. So if you have any questions, please do email me. I'll try to follow up here because we're out of time with the questions that have been asked individually. And in the next 24 hours, because I am going on vacation as of end of day tomorrow, you will receive before I leave the package that we talked about with those materials. So if you're interested in continuing the conversation and being part of these calls and the national and regional sessions, then to get connected to us. I want to thank everybody for coming out today, both here locally and on the call. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and thank you so much for your attention.